For those of you who don't know me, my name is Casey Ogle. I'm president of the Veteran Student Club here on campus. I'm a combat veteran myself. I was in the Army for 5 years. I was a paratrooper. Today, I'm going to discuss the Tuskegee Airmen, legacy and inspiration. What do y'all know about the Tuskegee Airmen? Nothing.
I've heard the name thrown around a lot, but I can't honestly say that I know. You know, when you talk about Black history, I hear that name thrown out, but I cannot say that.
Well, they were quite instrumental in like breaking down the barriers of segregation and everything. I mean, when we think of segregation, we think of the school systems and stuff like that. And when all that came about, Brown versus the Board of Education, that was instrumental in breaking down those barriers to get rid of segregation in schools. But now the military, they were worse. I mean, you could go die for your country, but people had to be in separate units because they couldn't be trusted or they didn't think they were smart enough. And these guys, they broke down that barrier, they broke that wall down. And after they did what they did, it was passed where there was no more segregation. All units were brought together. And it wasn't just in the African American community. I mean, if you weren't white, you were in your own unit. The Japanese American soldiers were in their own unit during World War II. I mean, it was just they separated everybody based on their skin color or where they come from. And because of these guys, that was gotten rid of. All right, let me start off. Since the beginning of the United States, African Americans have stood up and fought for a country that has not always stood up and fought for them. They have always been willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, even though they were not treated equally at home. As a country, we always talk about the sacrifices our men and women of the military face, but we do not discuss enough about those made by our African American brothers and sisters. To me, Black History Month is about American history. It lets us showcase and understand the struggles some of our greatest pioneers and leaders faced. Yet, they were still able to accomplish what others before them could not. Today, as I discuss some of the greatest soldiers that came before me, I want you to remember that it is the courage of your heart that matters, not the color of your skin. All right, let's start this off. I'm going to start this off with a quote that speaks to me all the time, but it is time for parents to teach young people early on that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. It's by Maya Angelou. I'm a history buff. I want to be a history teacher. And to me, we cannot know where we're going if we don't know where we're coming from. We cannot change the future if we relive the past. So to stop reliving the past, we need to understand what happened in the past. And it's important for us to understand what happened in the past. All right, I'm going to start this off. This right here is a war bond flyer for the Tuskegee Airmen, and this was just one for everybody else. What do y'all see that's different?
He's not smiling.
He's not, no. Also, this right here, it says, keep us flying. This one says, you buy them, we fly them. There's a different type of enthusiasm there. You know, this one's like begging, you know, we need your support, and this one right here is like, we're here to fight. Like, it just shows two different, the way things were perceived back then. All right, I'm going to start this off by, I said throughout history, African Americans have fought in every major conflict that we have ever had. And the first one that I'm going to talk about, and I could talk about every conflict, but in the War of 1812, we had to fight England again. And the British, what they would do is they would capture our ships, and they would take our sailors, and either they would put them in captivity or they'd say, hey, you're part of our Navy now. And because they were doing that, we didn't have people to sail on our boats. So they took slaves and they were putting them on the ships. And they were going out there, and they were the ones that were running these ships, and even some of them became boat captains. But then after the war ended, they went back to being slaves again. Some of them were able to buy their freedom, but you know, they did a great service to this country to protect us from, you know, falling back. And they were just kind of tossed to the side again when the war ended. Then of course we had the Buffalo Soldiers. They were a cavalry unit, and I mean, they basically defended the Midwest for us. And they were an all-black unit, but because people didn't think that African Americans were smart enough or could be trusted, they still had, you know, white officers that led them. And then we have some of my favorite. These guys were called the Harlem Hellfighters. They fought in World War I. And basically, they wanted to go fight. And there wasn't a unit that took African Americans at the time during World War I. And finally, when a unit came about, they sent them over there and they fought beside the French the whole time. But a lot of the stories they talk about is because they fought so hard, the French treated them like they would anybody else. They weren't treated differently. It was like the first time they've ever, you know, were treated as equals. And at the end of it, they had 2 Congressional Medal of Honors come out of that unit because they fought so hard. And then you have my favorite, the Triple Nickels. These guys, they were in World War II, and they were an airborne unit, all African American airborne unit. And they were training hard to go fight Hitler and fascism and all that. And they thought they were getting on the plane to go over to Germany to fight. And instead they were sent out to Oregon. Does anybody know what a smoke jumper is? These guys were America's first smoke jumpers. A smoke jumper is a guy that jumps out of an airplane into a fire and puts it out from the inside out.
Oh, wow.
Now today's smoke jumpers are trained firefighters. These guys were not trained firefighters. So they were sent out to Oregon and Washington State and California, and they had to jump out of planes into fires and put them out. And it was something they weren't trained for. They were trained for combat. But out of all that they did that throughout the war. They only lost one guy. One guy, that's it. And they stopped fires and saved many lives. So even though they didn't go overseas and fight, they did a great service to this country. And they were our first smoke jumpers. And then, you heard of a Buffalo Nickel? It comes from these guys. There's the Buffalo Soldiers, and then the Triple Nickels, Buffalo Nickel. All right, now we're going to get into what the presentation is about. Now, I told you about all those other units because those units were there and they were doing all this before the Tuskegee Airmen. But it was the Tuskegee Airmen that finally broke through that wall. These guys beat at it, but it was the Tuskegee Airmen that finally broke through it. So to this day, they call it the Tuskegee Experiment. And the reason why it was called an experiment is because nobody thought it was going to work. Nobody wanted it to work, but the pilots. The Army Air Corps, they formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group. The fighter group actually went overseas and they saw combat, but the bombardment group, they were the bombers and stuff. They never left stateside. In fact, most of them were locked up and waiting for trial through the rest of the war. Does anybody know who Thurgood Marshall is? Thurgood Marshall, who was our first African American Supreme Court justice, actually his first big case was defending those guys at the Tuskegee Airmen. What had happened was they went to an officers club that was all white, and they were told to leave, and they refused to leave. So they got thrown in the brig for mutiny, and they had to stand trial. And he defended them. He got them all off but one guy, but that guy got charged with assault and some other stuff. But when we say Tuskegee Airmen, the name doesn't just apply to the pilots. They had navigators, mechanics, instructors, crew chiefs, nurses, cooks. They had everything. Their whole unit down there was African American. This is the first time this ever happened in the history of our country. I mean, we had African American units, but everything else was white. Their leadership was white, you know, their support groups. This unit was all African American. Their commanders were, their doctors were, everybody. So this whole unit was run, you know, as an African American unit. But once again, nobody wanted them to succeed. They were pushed harder, tested harder than anybody else. It was created by, some of these pictures, they're old, so they're a little out of focus, but the unit was created by Franklin D Roosevelt, and the reason why he did it ultimately was because he wanted to appease the black voters to help get him elected. But the idea came from his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. She's the one that introduced the idea to him. And the reason being is before there was the Tuskegee Experiment, there actually was a pilot training school for African Americans down there. Was a civilian school. And she got to fly with one of the pilots, Charles Anderson. And because of that experience and that great experience, she came to her husband and said, look, this is a program you need to start, and this is why you need to start it. So it's because of the bug she whispered in his ear that started. But just because the president supported it doesn't mean anybody else did. The country didn't, the military didn't, and even some people in the African American community didn't, because they thought it was a joke. They thought they were being made fun of. In the beginning, when they started the program, all the recruits had to have at least a 2-year degree to be a pilot. They told them they had to have a 2-year degree. So that limited who could go into the program and become pilots. And so the people who didn't have 2-year degrees, they went and did other things like mechanics and cooks and everything else to still support. When they entered the war, when the Tuskegee Airmen, who later called themselves the Red Tails, and I'll explain why in a second, first got over there and entered the war, the United States was losing about 25 bombers a day on these bomb runs, which is a lot because I think each bomber carried 10 or 11 servicemen at a time. So if you're losing 25 today, it's a lot of people you're losing. And the reason why they were is because the fighters that they had escorting them, no sooner the German pilots would come in and attack them, they'd go to chase. So the Germans figured this out. So they'd send a couple people in to get them to leave, and then they'd come in and just mop up the bombers. So when the Tuskegee Airmen got there, you know, they thought they were going to get dog fights and, you know, do all this stuff, and they were told, we need you to escort the bombers. And at first they just thought it was a fool's errand, you know, and they didn't think they'd see any combat, and they weren't excited about it. But these guys were highly disciplined. And the reason being is because everybody wanted them to fail. The tests that they had to do were a lot harder. The pilot training they had to do was a lot harder. They had to do a test just to get into the candidate school. And some of these guys that were from up north would take this test, pass it. Then when they come down south, they tell them, you got to take it again. And then they take it again, they're like, oh, you didn't pass this time. And so they made it super hard for them. But because of this, these were some of the most highly disciplined soldiers you ever met because, you know, they went through more than any other man ever had to go through. They nicknamed themselves the Red Tails, and the reason being is when they got over there, they painted the rudder on their plane red. And they did that because they wanted the bombers and everything, when they saw them, to know who they were. Like, we're here to protect you, we're here to save you. And honestly, they did it so the Germans knew who they were too. Like I said, the Tuskegee Experiment was designed to fail. The very first class that they had a dozen pilots test for the pilot's license, and only 5 of them passed. But those 5 passed with flying colors, but only 5 out of 12 passed. Like I said, they did everything they could to prove them wrong because the country and the military, they were under the impression that black men couldn't fly. They weren't smart enough, they weren't disciplined enough, they couldn't fly. And the reason why they had this thought that they weren't smart enough and that they kept segregated units is in 1925, after World War I, the Army War College did a study on black soldiers. And I'm going to read you a little snippet that was in that study. And it was a long study, but one of the things they said is, on account of inherent weaknesses in Negro character, especially general lack of intelligence and initiative, it requires much longer time of preliminary training to bring a Negro organization up to the point of training where it is fit for combat than it does in the case of white men. All theoretical training is beyond the grasp of a Negro. It must be intensely practical, supplemental by plain talks explaining the reason for things in simple terms. That's what the Army had decided about African American soldiers. They just weren't smart enough. They weren't up to par. And because of this, there was no Negro officers, and there wasn't too many of them, were allowed to be over white officers. So it didn't matter if I was a captain and you were a captain, or it didn't matter if I was a captain and you were a major. You're obviously rank structure above me, but no, I can tell you what to do because I'm white, which isn't fair. But that's just the way the Army War College had stated. So this was going on in World War II, and that's another reason why this experiment was put into play, but nobody wanted it to work because it was messing up everything they knew. They also said that Negroes were not combat effective. They couldn't be trusted, that they were scared, that they would run away, which all the other units I showed you, I mean, they'd proven it 10 times over. But that's what they kept saying. One of the things that bothered a lot of African American troops, and this wasn't just in the Tuskegee Airmen, but all over, was during World War II, German POWs were brought back stateside, and they were put in the military bases here. And they were actually allowed to walk about freely, go anywhere they wanted to. And during that time, African Americans, they were only allowed to go to the post exchange, which is like a store, only once a week. They had designated time, designated day they were allowed to go. German POWs, our enemies, were allowed to go any day they wanted, any time they wanted. So our own troops were being treated worse than our enemy was. A lot of the, this right here is a picture, because you know they were pilots and stuff, but this just shows them as radio men and everything else. I mean, they did all the different jobs. They ran this whole unit themselves. So at the end of World War II, the Red Tails, Tuskegee Airmen, they had a lot of accomplishments. First off, after they got their name out there, bomber pilots were requested for red tail. They call them the Red Tail Angels, is what they called them. And they were requested for them to escort them to their destination. And at first they didn't know they were African American pilots, but when they did, and they would see them out, you know, they treated them with the same respect as they would anybody else, because these are guys that made sure they got home every time. Now, it was said that they never lost a single bomber. Of course, that's been disputed throughout the years, but any research that's ever looked back to see how many bombers they've lost, they only say they lost about 25 through the whole war, which is good if you think about it, because at the beginning I told you that they were losing 25 a day before they got over there. 25 a day. So then at the end of it, they only maybe lost 25, period. I mean, it's amazing to think about it, because they had discipline to not chase, you know, not leave. They held their ground. Even when being shot at and everything else, they held their ground. They would sacrifice themselves over the bombers every time, because they knew the bombers had a greater mission that they had to get to. They flew 15,000 combat sorties with combat missions. They downed more than 100 enemy planes. There's even a report that one pilot shot down 3 in a row during one of the battles. 32 of the airmen were actually prisoners of war. And there were 996 aviators trained in the Tuskegee program during World War II. Now, of course, only about half of them actually went over and saw combat, but there was 996 who were trained as pilots. 19,000 service members and civilians participated in this experiment. So that goes to what I was telling you, the cooks and the mechanics and everything else. That's how many that were participating in making this happen. 66 airmen actually gave their lives in combat. So we lost 66 guys. And then afterwards, and this is probably the greatest accomplishment, I think, 3 of the Tuskegee Airmen actually went on to become generals. Daniel James was appointed a brigadier general by Nixon. Benjamin Davis Jr. was actually the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. And he was actually their commanding officer during all this. The guys said they wouldn't have followed anybody else. He was hard, tough as nails, but he made sure that they stayed respectful and stayed accordingly to military structure at all times. I mean, he trained these guys, no matter what people say to you or do to you, you show respect. You show respect to the uniform. You do not act like they do. And so, he wanted professionalism, and these guys were professional. And then there was Lucius Theus. He was retired. He ended up retiring as a major general. Also, to this day, there's a Tuskegee Association, and they're actually fighting to try to get this story put in textbooks, because in a lot of high schools, middle schools, the Tuskegee Experience, it's not in there. It's not there. It's not being taught in the schools. People don't know about it. You may hear about it, or you may have saw a movie, but it's not something that's taught. In all, the Tuskegee Airmen earned 8 Purple Hearts, 14 Bronze Stars, 3 Distinguished Unit Citations, and they earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. And that's like the highest medal that a pilot can earn. 96 of them earned that. In July 26, 1948, President Truman, he abolished the racial discrimination in the armed forces. He got rid of it. He got rid of segregation. He integrated all the units, and he did it because of these men, because of what they accomplished. They knocked down that wall within the military. So, as a country, that was our first big step, because our military got rid of it. Now we can serve shoulder to shoulder, right beside each other. And then in 2007, the remaining Tuskegee Airmen were actually presented with a Congressional Gold Medal. You got the Congressional Medal of Honor, but then for civilians, you can get the Gold Medal. And President Bush presented that to the last members. And if you actually go to the Smithsonian, you can actually see that there. Here's some other pictures. I don't know if you can see this because it's black and white, but they got the tails painted red. And that way, when they pulled up next to the bombers, they knew who was escorting them. The Red Tail Angels. So, there's a couple stories, because a lot of these guys come from all over the U.S. Some of them from up north, some of them from out west, some of them from down south. Well, the guys that were from up north had different experiences than the guys from down south, because a lot of those guys didn't go to segregated schools that were from up north, and they didn't really see the level of racism that you did down south. And there's a story of one of the guys who was from New York City, and he was going down for the pilot training. He was super excited. He wanted to fly from the first time he saw a plane. He got onto the train, sat down, and he's riding the train, and they had to do a stop in Washington, D.C. And he was super excited. He's never seen the nation's capital before. He's sitting there on the train. He's in uniform, and police officers just walking through looking. And when he stops, he looks at him. He goes, "Son, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm getting ready to go to training. I want to be, an African-American pilot." He goes, "I don't give a damn about that. I want to know what you're doing." And he said, I'm sitting here. He goes, why are you sitting here? He said, the seat was open. He goes, no, your kind doesn't sit here. And he moved him back behind the actual train car where all the coal smoke was blowing and everything, and he sat him there. And he said that was the first time in his life he was told where he could sit because of his skin color, or where he couldn't sit. And so he's sitting there, angry, upset, and he said he's looking out the window, and he's like, I wonder if the policymakers, here in Washington, D.C. know what's going on in their town. And he said, well, until years later, he realized they fully knew what was going on. And that was the first time he had experienced anything like that. But then the guys that were from down south, they grew up around that. I mean, it was the norm. But they said when they actually joined that unit and became a Tuskegee Airman, it wasn't until then that they saw equality, because everybody there was treated the same. So, because you had all African Americans running this community, so they were all treated the same. It was the first time they ever saw that. So it just shows kind of the differences. We actually had a guy who lived around here. His name was Armour McDaniel, and he was a pilot, and he actually was a teacher in this area before he went to do that program. Taught history, English, and his brother come and told him about it. He signed up, and he was a second lieutenant. He flew, and he did combat missions and everything else. So it just shows the different walks of life that these guys come from. And to go over there and give it their all, knowing when they come back they're going to be treated worse than the enemy was, I mean, that shows a testament. That shows a testament of what these guys stood for. I mean, most people, don't know that kind of sacrifice. I'm going to end this off with a quote. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And I think these good men knew that. So they still stood up for what they believed in. It didn't matter what others believed in. So, do we have any questions? No? Well, thank y'all for coming and sitting with me and listening to me ramble.